Welcome everyone to Recipes for Disaster Preparedness. This class is going to talk about food safety information, some simple recipes that you can prepare without, say, electricity, and we'll talk about what kind of ingredients to keep stocked in your pantry in case of an emergency. And I'll also try to make this interactive as much as possible. So I'll be asking you some questions and you can share your answers in the chat. So again, if you're just joining us, this is being recorded, so be sure to keep yourself on mute if you don't want to show up in the recording. But basically, you know, there are all kinds of disasters that can happen, not to be negative, but we are in the middle of a pandemic. We've also had wildfires this year that have created poor air quality. We can have power outages, either planned or unplanned. Storms, earthquakes, just to name a few that can happen here in the Bay Area. So I actually practiced some of these recipes back in August and September when we had a combination of pandemic, wildfires causing really poor air quality, and heat waves. So I did have electricity for the most part, but it was just so hot in here, especially with the windows closed, that I didn't really want to turn on the oven or stove to cook. So these recipes, you don't have to wait for a disaster to happen. They're just really simple and you can use them anytime. On a day like today where here I think it's going to get into the high 90s, so you might not want to turn on things in your kitchen that are going to create heat. These recipes are also great for camping where you don't have electricity, so you can use them on a camping trip as well. Yesterday was actually the International Shakeout Day, where the idea is to practice what you would do in case of an earthquake. So if you're interested in learning more about what to do outside of food-related things, you can check out shakeout.org and create a plan for earthquakes. Today, actually, I just realized today is World Food Day, which is about awareness of hunger, health, and sustainable food systems. So all kinds of things going on right now. All right, so in case of an emergency, you might have to cook just whatever you have on hand. You might not be able to get to the store and you might not have power. So we'll talk about things that you can keep in your kitchen just in case. You know, you may not even have running water, so you may have difficulty cleaning things and you know, so we just want to be prepared in case that ever happens. So let's get started. And I asked some questions in the chat earlier while we were waiting to get started. So if you are just joining, you can feel free to add your input. The questions were, what kind of foods have you kept stocked during this pandemic? And what are some easy no-cook meals that you like to prepare? Okay, so I'm going to show you this first one, which is a Mediterranean chickpea salad. I was going to mention that we have a similar recipe on our website that somebody actually mentioned in the chat. It's a curried chickpea salad. It also requires no cooking, just requires a few ingredients that you would store in the refrigerator. So this one is super easy, just using ingredients that you can keep in your pantry. So what we're going to do is prepare this in a bowl, and then we're going to let it sit for half an hour to let the flavors combine. And we're using some dried onion, so it's going to help rehydrate the dried foods that we're adding. So let me get my recipe here. This recipe serves maybe 2 or 3 people because if you don't have refrigeration, you only really want to prepare what you can eat at that one time. And anything that's left out for more than 2 hours should really be refrigerated, which may not be an option, or should be discarded. So you don't want to prepare too much. But if you have more people in your home, you want to serve 4 to 6, then easily you can double this recipe. So I'm going to be using 1 can of chickpeas. You can also find different beans and chickpeas in jars. So those can be nice to have in case you know, you want to take them camping or somewhere where you may not have a can opener. And you could also keep them in your emergency kit in case you don't have a can opener in there, but probably a good idea to get a can opener as well. Okay, so I'm gonna drain these. And in the event that you don't have running water, draining them is just fine. But if you do have running water, might as well rinse them. That will help rinse off some of the salt. If there's salt in your chickpeas, and helps to wash away some of those sugars that can cause gas. Okay, so the next thing we're going to add is some jarred red peppers, and you can find different forms of these. These ones are pimentos, so they're already sliced up. All I have to do is throw it in the bowl. Here's a bigger jar of roasted red peppers that are kind of sliced, so you might want to chop them up a bit, but this is bigger and I don't want to use the whole jar. This one is probably right about the correct amount of half a cup. I should have practiced opening it before this class started because now my hands are wet and slippery. Okay, well, I'm going to show you my trick. I just use a silicone, what are these things called? Pot holder. There we go. So I'm going to drain these as well. There's just a little bit of extra liquid in there that we don't need. That should be right about half a cup. And what I like about this recipe is it's totally flexible. So if there's some ingredient in here that you don't like, you can just leave it out. You can also just use whatever you have on hand. So maybe you have some, you know, sun-dried tomatoes or artichoke hearts or sliced olives. You can really customize this however you want. It's basically a salad, and salads are always pretty flexible. I'm also going to add some capers. This is going to give it a lot of flavor. They're also pretty salty, so just keep in mind, definitely taste this recipe before you add any salt, because there's a good chance you're not going to need any at all. Okay, so, you know, unfortunately, if you have these in your pantry and there's an emergency and you don't have electricity, you're probably not going to want to add an entire jar. So hopefully, you know, maybe you have these in your refrigerator already, or you do have, maybe hopefully the power comes back on quickly so you can get those in the fridge. Something else that I want to point out is that while having a cooler with ice in it can be helpful for keeping things cool, it's not really going to cool them down to a safe temperature. So for example, if you prepare something and you want to refrigerate it and there's no power, that wouldn't really work to put it in the cooler. But let's say you have something in your refrigerator that you want to keep cool and the power goes out, then putting it in a cooler with ice will help keep it cooler, probably a little bit longer. All right, so the next thing we're going to add is some olive oil. So we're sort of making a vinaigrette here. So I'm going to add equal parts olive oil to vinegar. I personally like red wine vinegar in this recipe, but you can also use whatever you have on hand. Could be balsamic vinegar, white wine vinegar, white vinegar, apple cider. Okay, so 2 tablespoons of olive oil, and then I'll add 2 tablespoons of vinegar. All right, and then we're going to add some dried parsley, which honestly is not going to give it a ton of flavor. So if you don't have this, it's not really a big deal, but does make it look really nice and has, you know, some flavor. Some dried herbs don't have a lot of flavor, like dried basil and parsley, for example. Others, like dried oregano, do still have a lot of flavor, so they're a little more useful. And you could throw that in here if you like as well, or you could add some kind of Italian seasoning mix too. So yeah, do whatever you want. And, you know, and if you're making this fresh, you could totally just use fresh minced onion, but let's say it's an emergency and we don't have access to that, we can just add some dried minced onion, and it'll sort of rehydrate in the dressing and give it a lot of flavor. So we'll do 2 teaspoons. I personally don't use dried minced onion much, but the reason why I have this is because we have a recipe on our site for uh, a holiday gift that's, what is it called? Curried lentil soup that you can make in a jar so that you can give it away as a gift. You can use like an old peanut butter jar if you have a glass one. You can layer the lentils and the spices, and then the person you give it to can just throw that in a pot with some water and have lentil soup in half an hour. So it's a gift idea since the holidays are coming up. Okay, so I think that's everything. You can add optional ingredients if you'd like. And I'll just show you what that's going to look like. So we have a nice colorful little salad there. And again, you can add other ingredients that will give it some color, like artichoke hearts, or if you have access to it or it's not an emergency, you can feel free to throw in other fresh vegetables in here, like I mentioned. Red onion would be really good. You could add cucumber or tomatoes, and you could eat this with a green salad if you have it. If not, you could eat it by itself, or you could have it with crackers or bread or whatever you'd like. So I'm just going to set that aside and let those flavors combine for about half an hour. All right, so between recipes, I want to talk a little bit about food safety. So here's a trivia question for you. How many days of supply should you keep on hand in your emergency kit? So put in the chat, put your guesses in the chat. So you'll see we have this food safety information for this class. There's a lot of information on here. The first page talks about preparing for an emergency. The bottom talks about what to do during an emergency, and the back says what to do afterwards. And most of this information is specifically about food. There's a lot of other things that we should do to be prepared that have nothing to do with food, like what else to keep in your emergency kit, not just food. You know, things like flashlight, maybe blankets, spare food, medications. I'm not going to go through all of that because that's a whole nother class, but there's some resources where you can find out more. There's an emergency preparedness website through the city of Berkeley and through Alameda County. A lot of the information I got for this handout is from foodsafety.gov. And I'm sure you could also look up your county if you're not in Alameda or Berkeley and get emergency preparedness information. Okay, so what guesses do we have? 3 days, 2 weeks, 5 days, 7 days. So kind of all of those are correct. I would say at a bare minimum 3 days, ideally 2 weeks, which I know is a lot too, and this is per person. So you'll need quite a bit of storage space if you're going to do 2 weeks. How about how much water should you have per person per day? So while you're putting in your guesses, I'll just talk about some other food safety info. And most fruits and vegetables will actually hold their quality at room temperature. Apples, bananas, tomatoes, grapes, even heads of lettuce, squash, onions, potatoes, celery, peppers, and other produce will keep as long as they're stored in a cool, dark place. So, you know, if there's a heat wave and you have a really sunny window, that's not where you want to put them, but maybe just in a cool cabinet. Okay, so what guesses do we have for water? 1 gallon per person, 2 liters. I think 2 liters is pretty close to a gallon. So the recommendation is 1 gallon per person per day and also per pet. So yeah, quite a bit of water is recommended to keep on hand, because if you don't have running water, you're not just using it for drinking, you might be using it for cleaning your hands, you know, brushing your teeth, all kinds of things. So a gallon per person or pet per day is the recommendation. Again, minimum 3 days, ideally 2 weeks, which I know would be a lot of stored water. So this handout talks a little bit more about your emergency water supply. So that minimum of 1 gallon, you may actually want more if you're in a hot climate or for pregnant women or sick people. If your bottled water has an odor, don't drink it or use it, just dispose of it. And observe the expiration date for store-bought water, and for other stored water, just replace it every 6 months. I do want to talk about disinfecting water in case you run out of bottled water, since it's recommended to have quite a bit. You can use different things to clean it, including chlorine bleach, believe it or not, iodine, and there's also water disinfection tablets, which you can get at places like sporting goods stores and pharmacies. So for bleach, it's recommended to use 2 drops per quart of water. So just really teeny tiny bit. This is only if you really need it. You know, obviously don't want to drink bleach or anything, but a tiny bit, if your water isn't safe and it's your only option, you can use that to kill some of the bacteria. So there's detailed information through the EPA that I linked on the handout. For iodine, it's 5 drops of a 2% tincture to each liter of water, or if it's cloudy or colored water, use 10 drops and stir and let it stand for 30 minutes. So you can find more details on how to do that online. Okay, so that was a nice little break. Let's keep cooking here. So the next thing we're going to do is make a really easy no-bake dessert, and that's these chocolate chip peanut butter balls. This recipe is adapted from a website called Chocolate Covered Katie. All right, so this might satisfy a cookie craving if you have one. It's not quite the same because they're not baked. Oh, somebody asked about the handout. It's linked in the chat towards the top, but there's a lot going on in the chat. It's also in the decal and should be in the reminder email as well. Okay, so there's a lot of similar recipes to this that are like a no-bake, energy, cookie bite type of thing, but most of them require a food processor. So it took me a while to find one that didn't require like grinding up dates in a food processor. So if you do have power and you want to try this, feel free to try any of those other recipes. But this one uses basically peanut butter and maple sugar to, or maple syrup to hold it together so that you don't have to use the food processor. So I'm going to take a little bowl here, and we're going to add the oats. So I'm using rolled oats. You don't want to use steel cut oats because we're eating these raw and those would be very hard to eat. I think instant oats would probably work just fine in here. Okay, so we need ½ a cup of oats. These are, rolled oats or old-fashioned oats are the 2 different names. They mean basically the same thing. Okay, so ½ a cup of oats. And then we're going to add ½ a cup of peanut butter. So these ingredients I put on the grocery list, and I put them in bold. So these are things that I recommend buying, but especially if you want to make these recipes, they're in bold. Okay, so I have some natural peanut butter. This is the first time I'm opening it, you can see. And natural peanut butter separates. So what I like to do is store it upside down, and that helps get the oil to the top. And if you put it in the refrigerator, once you get it all combined, I'm going to use a spoon. Once you get it all combined, you can store it in the fridge, and that will just keep it from separating. So it just takes a minute to mix it all up. So this recipe has some kind of filling properties. We've got oats, which have lots of fiber, and we have peanut butter, which has some healthy fats and tastes delicious. If you don't like peanut butter, or you're allergic to peanuts, or you have someone with a peanut allergy in your family, you can substitute other nut butters like almond or cashew. And if you have someone with a tree nut allergy and peanut allergy, or just don't like it, there's other butters that you can even use, like sunflower butter. Tastes a little different, but That's kind of the closest substitute. Okay, so we want 1/2 cup of the nut butter. So yes, this recipe is very peanut buttery, so it's not really for people who aren't fans of peanut butter, but we need quite a bit in order to hold everything together. All right. So next we're going to add maple syrup, and I think probably other liquid sweeteners would work just fine in this recipe, but we're going to add 3 tablespoons. And then if your peanut butter is unsalted, you can just add a pinch of salt. But if your peanut butter is salted, try it first. Well, either way, try it first and see if you need the salt. But oftentimes, a little bit of salt is added to baked goods or desserts. This isn't necessarily baked, just to give it a little bit of that. It helps enhance the flavor. Okay, so we're gonna add oat flour to help bind it. And I tested this recipe with both coconut flour and oat flour. And I preferred the oat flour slightly. I think they were pretty similar, but I just think the texture was a little bit better with the oat flour. So this might not be something that you have on hand. So let me just measure it first. We need 2 tablespoons. And you can adjust this. So you could even start with a little bit less if you want to make sure that these aren't too dry. So I might do like 1.5 tablespoons. So the thing is, you don't want to use raw wheat flour in here or all-purpose flour because that can be contaminated. So usually you don't want to eat raw flour. But you could use, if you don't have oat flour while you still have electricity, you could create your own just by running rolled oats like we're using in here through a food processor until they form like a floury consistency. Might also work with like ground flax meal. I haven't tried that personally, but yeah, those are a few different options that you can use. Okay, so now we're going to do the best part. Oh, I forgot to mention, I think I have some almond meal here. I think that would probably work well in this recipe too. If you have someone with a gluten allergy or intolerance, I need to add this to the recipe here. Some oats can be cross-contaminated with gluten, so you would want to look for certified gluten-free oats and gluten-free oat flour. Okay, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of chocolate. And I actually had a hard time finding chocolate chips at the beginning of this pandemic. So what I ended up doing was buying a big old bar of chocolate, a big, huge one, and just cut that up and used it. And they actually kind of have different properties when it comes to cooking and baking. But if that ever happens, you can always just chop up some chocolate bar and throw it in here. Okay, and the last thing that we're going to add is just a little bit of vanilla extract. I think this helps give it more of a cookie flavor, and it helps keep it a little bit more moist. So we're just going to add 1/2 teaspoon. So it should kind of form a solid ball, and that's when you know it's ready. And then you can adjust it if necessary. If it's really dry or you want it a little bit sweeter, you know, these are kind of lightly sweet with just 3 tablespoons of sweetener. You can maybe add a little bit more, which would moisten it. Or if it's too wet, you could add a little bit more of the oat flour or whatever flour that you're using. And I'm just going to take a container And just scoop out about a tablespoon at a time and just roll it into a ball and throw it in the container. So depending on what you're using, I think the types of peanut butters and nut butters can really vary. You might have to adjust this recipe a little bit depending on the consistency, if it's too wet or too dry. So this should make about 16 if you do tablespoon size, because we have about 1 cup of ingredients here, and there's actually 16 tablespoons in a cup. So if you need to do recipe conversions, there's 4 tablespoons per 1/4 cup, so that times 4 is 16 tablespoons. And in case you need to know, there's 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon. Okay, so while I'm doing that, let's go back to our food safety information here. So I also wanted to keep talking about refrigeration. So here's a question for you for the chat. How long will your refrigerator stay cold in a power outage? Four hours, 1 day, 72 hours. Okay, how about freezer? I'm gonna let you keep answering that before I tell you the answer. How long will your freezer stay cold? 48 hours, a day if you don't open the door. So while you're answering, I'll just let you know, it kind of depends on, the size of your refrigerator freezer. It's not going to be exactly the same based on all models. For your freezer, it also depends on how full it is. So the answer is, this is I think from foodsafety.gov, the refrigerator will keep cold for 4 hours, 4 hours for the refrigerator if it's unopened. But that's why, if let's say you have a power outage and you're not exactly sure how long it's going to last, maybe it's not after a huge earthquake or something, maybe it's just a down power line. Maybe on the safe side, you'd want to make one of these recipes that doesn't require the refrigerator, opening the refrigerator, just in case, just so you can keep that stuff cool a little bit longer. So 4 hours for the fridge if it's unopened. Okay, so there's our little peanut butter chocolate chip balls. Your freezer should stay cold for about 48 hours if it's full and if you keep the door closed. If it's half full, then it will probably only stay cold for about 24 hours. So a full freezer is actually better. It also makes your freezer more energy efficient. So you'll use less power to keep a full freezer. So definitely nothing wrong with keeping your freezer fully stocked. A full refrigerator, on the other hand, will probably take a little bit more power to keep things cold. So 4 hours for the fridge, 48 hours for a full freezer. Both of those are if you keep them mostly closed. Okay, so if you do have a power outage, definitely keep the fridge and freezer closed as much as possible. And if you have access to ice packs, you can put that in a cooler and keep some things that you want to stay cool in there a little bit longer. You can also take things, if you have things that you really want to keep cold and save them, say maybe like if you are pumping breast milk and you really want to save that, maybe you put that in the freezer in case of an emergency, or if you have some expensive cut of meat or something, maybe it won't taste so great after it's been thawed anyway, but that's how you can extend the shelf life a little bit. And if you do plan to eat the refrigerated or frozen meat, poultry, fish, eggs, whatever, just make sure you cook them thoroughly to a safe internal temperature to make sure any foodborne bacteria is destroyed. So this is not just in case of emergency, but in any case, If food is left out at more than 40 degrees for 2 hours or more, then you should discard it. So that applies if it's, you know, just a regular dinner that you're having, or during, say, Thanksgiving or a holiday meal. You know, a lot of times that food gets left out for a long time, but you really do want to make sure it gets in the refrigerator within 2 hours. If the temperature is above 90, let's say on a day like today, or you're having a picnic, then food should only be out for 1 hour. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you, this recipe I didn't link, but I can send out in the email a link to it, because this is an old recipe from a class that we did called Rustic Meals for Camping, Cookouts, or Home, something like that. So it's a template for a foil packet meal. So this is something that I make pretty much every time I go camping, because it's so easy and it's a great way to get some veggies. So you just want a sheet of foil, ideally, what's it called? Heavy duty foil, which I don't have, but I'm just going to show you how to do this. And you can use different vegetables. I like to use something starchy to give it some substance, like a potato or sweet potato, but these take the longest to cook. So we want to cut everything in the right size so that it cooks quickly enough. Now, the reason why I'm doing this for this class is if your power goes out, and I think somebody mentioned this in the chat, is that you can cook food on the grill if you have an outdoor grill. So this is a way that you can get some veggies during a power outage if you want to use up your fresh veggies. And I'm not going to actually grill this, so I'm just going to kind of demonstrate what you would do. So you want to cut things like potatoes into coins so that they can cook quickly. And I like to put them at the bottom. So that's where the most heat is going to be. And I'm just going to do mini one again because I'm not actually cooking this. And then you can really add whatever vegetables you like. I think onions, roasted or grilled, are delicious and give it a lot of flavor, and they're really cheap and easy to keep around. So I always throw some onion in there. So the idea is that you make this packet and you can throw it on the grill. And for camping, what you can do is put it in your campfire. So onions have a little bit more water. They're going to take a little bit less time to cook. So this onion is actually really small. So I think I'm going to cut it in just 4 pieces and kind of break those up in there. So if you're camping, you would cook this over the campfire, and the best way to do it is to wait until the fire dies down and just cook it in the embers. But oftentimes when I'm camping, I'm out doing something during the day, and I come back and make a fire and I want to make dinner, and I don't want to wait 3 hours for the fire to die. So I just cook it on a grill grate over the fire. So let's say you have all your veggies here. I was going to add some bell pepper as well. Bell pepper cooks really quickly, so I'm going to put that on top. And then if you'd like, you can add a protein source here. It could even be tofu or tempeh, especially if you've marinated it, it will have a little bit more flavor. Or you can add meat or chicken or fish. But just be aware that if you put something raw like that in here, and whether you're camping or just at home preparing this during a power outage, be really careful that you don't cross-contaminate. So, for example, if you're going to take this camping, make sure that you wrap it up really tight and put it in a waterproof or airtight bag so that it doesn't contaminate the other food in your cooler. Okay, so we're going to have this centered here. And if you're going to do a protein, I would put it on top. And then you can season it however you'd like. So I might put just a little bit of the seasoning mix on here, but I'm not going to do that since I'm not cooking it. And there's different ways you can wrap it up. You just want to make sure you don't overstuff it, because if it's overflowing, then it's really just going to explode while you're cooking it and make a big mess. So you can just kind of wrap it up like a packet like that, or you can do it so that you kind of roll up the edges And then when you're cooking it, if you're doing it on a grill at home, just heat up your grill and plop that on there. And just maybe you want to turn it. So you'll need a big spatula like this or some tongs. When I go camping and cook it over the fire, I like to bring my barbecue tongs so you can flip it. Just don't overhandle it because the foil will start to rip and you'll have a mess. But you can carefully check it if you have, you know, gloves, or can open it up with the tongs and just check to see if your meat is cooked if you're using it and if the vegetables are tender. So I can't really tell you how long it takes. It really, really depends on the heat of your fire and how close it is. But if I had to guess, when I do just vegetables and go camping, I would say I cook it for maybe 15, 20 minutes or so. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit more about food safety and what to keep on hand. There's all kinds of one dish foil packet meals that you can make. So there's all kinds of other recipes out there if you'd want. Trying to keep up with the questions. Somebody asked, can you freeze packets before going in the cooler for transit? If it's mostly fresh vegetables, I don't think I would, because I don't think I guess if it's an emergency you could, but I think it will kind of negatively affect the quality of the vegetables. A lot of raw vegetables don't freeze very well. If you blanch them, then they freeze a little better, but it might affect the quality. So other things to keep in mind, you know, I mentioned you might have to find quite a bit of storage space for all this food. So one idea is to get one of those gift wrapping storage containers that fit under your bed. You can store food and supplies in there. Probably not water bottles, but other supplies you can keep in there. Oh, concern about foil. Thank you for asking that, because I was going to bring that up. I haven't seen really enough evidence to be worried about cooking things in foil. I personally don't do it much because the only times I would probably use foil would be for roasting things in the oven. And what I like to use to prevent sticking and for easy cleanup, it's a little bit more eco-friendly, I think, are these silicone baking mats. They're reusable and they keep food from sticking. So really the only time I ever use foil, I think, is for cooking these packets. But if you want to be on the safe side, you could probably put parchment paper on the inside, or you can actually use lettuce. And the first time I made these, I learned to line the packet with lettuce and then put everything in there, and it's supposed to keep the food a little bit more moist. So you could do it that way as well, and then just toss the lettuce. All right, so for your emergency supplies, how often do you think you should check that? Let's put that in the chat. How often to check your emergency supplies? Six months, twice a year. Similar answers here. Yeah, that's the recommendation, is once or twice a year. And to help you remember, you could do it when we have daylight savings time and or begin, which is coming up in, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. So might be a good time to check your emergency supplies. So you can check the expiration dates and get rid of things that have expired, or if they haven't expired yet, then you can maybe just go ahead and use them and then restock. And the dates are a little confusing. If it says best by whatever date, that's really just for the manufacturer to say when it's at its highest quality, so you don't necessarily need to get rid of it. Or the sell by date, really, that's just the last date that the store can sell it. So that's expecting you to store the food at home for a while. So sell by dates, for most foods, you can go a little bit beyond. And then keep in mind that low acid canned foods, which is meat, fish, and really most vegetables, will actually stay okay to eat for 2 to 5 years. So they'll really last a long time. Okay. So let's take a look at our salad here. Doesn't really look a whole lot different, but you can maybe see that the parsley and the onion has become a little bit more hydrated. So now would be when you could eat it. Yeah, everything looks a little bit more softened in there. Smells good. Okay, so after an emergency, unfortunately, depending on how long you have a power outage, you would probably want to throw away any food that just hasn't been stored properly, refrigerated or frozen properly, any food that may have come into contact with flood water or storm water. So if you're storing your emergency supplies in a garage or a basement, maybe try to put them up on a higher shelf in case it floods. As long as that room doesn't get totally flooded, it'll keep your food a little bit safer. And if it has an unusual odor, flavor, color, texture, then best to just toss it and not risk it. So another tip is to keep an appliance thermometer in your refrigerator and freezer, and to check the temperature when the power comes back on. So your freezer should, if it's 40 degrees or below, you know, freezing point for most things is 32 degrees, right? But if it's 40 or below, the food is still safe, and it can be refrozen. It may affect the quality and the texture a little bit, but at least it should be safe. If you don't have a thermometer in the freezer, you can check each package of food to determine if it's safety. And you can't really tell on the appearance alone, because you know things like bacteria are pretty much invisible to the human eye. So if the food still has ice crystals, or you check the temperature and it's 40 or below, then it's safe to refreeze it or cook it. Again, refrigerated food is safe as long as the power wasn't out for more than 4 hours and the door was shut. So if the power was out for a whole day in the refrigerator, even if you kept it closed, probably most of it's not safe. If you have raw meat in there, I would throw it away. If you have something in the refrigerator like, lettuce or carrots, then those are safe, because those are safe at room temperature anyway, so you don't have to throw everything away, just the foods that really require refrigeration. Okay, so after a flood, there's some specific information. You just want to make sure that, flood water obviously can be contaminated. You want to make sure that everything is really clean. So there's information on what kind of food you can salvage if there is a flood. So again, resources are foodsafety.gov. Alameda County has a website, ec.gov/ready. The City of Berkeley has a site, cityofberkeley.info/ready. And if you live elsewhere, then your county or city should have some emergency preparedness information as well. So that is everything that I had for today. Let me see if there are any questions. Nicole, feel free to chime in. I know I asked a lot of questions, so there's a lot going on in the chat, but if there's any good questions I missed, let me know, or just repeat them in the chat and I'll try to get to some of them. A takeaway emergency kit in case you have to leave your home. Yeah, that's a really good idea too, to have a go bag. There's some resources online that tell you recommended things to keep in there. I created one with a backpack that I think I got for free from somebody, one of those tech companies was giving away backpacks or whatever, and they gave it to me. So I just keep that in the hall closet by the front door. And I personally keep things in there like a blanket. I got some of those emergency blankets that are kind of like foil, so they're really small. I have extra socks and clothing in there, a scarf. I have a photocopy of my driver's license and passport. I have some cash in there, including small bills. What else? Carabiners, flashlight. There's all kinds of, that's just a few supplies, but I would definitely look that up online. So this is in case of, say, an emergency, an earthquake and you need to leave, or some other natural disaster. So some recommended websites, NERT or CERT, N-E-R-T or C-E-R-T may have some info. Even UC Berkeley, I know, has some links for emergency preparedness and what to keep in your kit. And if you're not working from home, if you do you know, eventually go back to campus, there's some recommendations of what to keep at work as well. You can even keep some supplies in your car, which I know is a risk with car break-ins around here, but that might be something to consider too. So question, oh, Alameda County has a good site for kit lists. Yeah, thank you, Min. So question is, flip-top cans seem to be more convenient, but in terms of safety, are regular canned foods recommended? So I think it talks about this a little bit for commercially prepared food like cans, metal pouches, plastic. So has some information on how to sanitize the cans. And according to, I think this was foodsafety.gov, they say food containers with screw caps, snap lids, crimped caps, twist caps, flip tops, and snap tops. Oh, that's a tongue twister. It says to discard those if they come into contact with flood water. So yeah, if possible, you might want to keep food elevated. You know, if you're keeping your supplies under your bed, then if you're on the first floor, that could potentially get flooded. But if that's the only space you have, especially if you're not at risk for flooding, then that should be fine. Any other questions I missed? I don't know what the peak of participants was, but this was by far the biggest cooking class we've had. Right now there's about 70. I think I saw it get into the 80s. So thank you. You're all part of having us have our biggest cooking class yet. So that's kind of a silver lining of getting to do some online classes. So I'll stick around and I'll stop the recording. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and once I stop the recording, feel free to unmute yourself and just say hi or ask a question. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll send out the evaluation and I'll post these recipes online as well.